For 160 million years, the dinosaurs ruled the planet. From their humble progenitors in the Triassic to the tyrant lizard king of the late Cretaceous, Dinosauria was a clade unmatched in its dominion. And then, 66 million years ago, that came to an abrupt and near total end. With the sole exception of aves, every clade of dinosaur went extinct. But what if they hadn't? Dragons of the Cenozoic follows the development of a world where the KPG event took place, but where a little bit of luck allowed a handful of species of non-avian dinosaurs to survive in a refugium in eastern Antarctica. This is the story of how the greatest dynasty the world has ever known recovered in a world it no longer ruled. There is a common misconception that mammals breathed through the KPG extinction because of their position as small generalists. This was not the case. The dominant clades of mammals had undergone a massive shakeup during the Angiosperm terrestrial revolution in the latter half of the late Cretaceous, which saw many older mammals and mammalia forms become displaced as more derived mammals proved to have better dentition to deal with the new seeds and insects that proliferated during the ATR. However, this explosion in diversity came to an abrupt pause with the meteor impact 66 million years ago. Multituberculates, while able to recover to a degree in North America and even go on to field their largest known genus in the Paleocene, never managed to regain their Asian diversity. Metatherians, like the marsupials and sparassodonts, managed to migrate into South America, Antarctica, and eventually Australia in the Paleocene, but were devastated in their diversity and never recovered in North America, going extinct on the continent until the gaby allowed the possum to reinvade. Southern hemisphere clades such as the Meridiolestids and Gondwanatheres survived the impact, but never recovered and were eventually displaced by Metatherian sparassodonts and marsupials and Eutherian placentals. The Eutriconodonts, which had been in steep decline since the ATR, were dealt a final killing blow by the impact and vanished entirely. By the late Paleocene, after emerging from the leveled post-KPG landscape, Eutherians would come to be the dominant group of mammals on nearly every continent save for 3, and even on 2 of those continents they would make up the lion's share of herbivorous mammalian fauna, while the Metatherians were largely confined to the roles of carnivores and insectivores. In the world of dragons of the Cenozoic, no greater diversity of mammals survived alongside the 4 clades of Dracoavians, which persisted in the Tasmanian Gateway and radiated outwards. However, the persistence of these 4 clades has changed the ecological situation of early Danian Gondwana. In the first episode covering the Sobral Formation, we saw how the persistence and population rebound of ground-nesting Dracoavians led to the diversification of Meridiolestids, as we saw small insectivores radiate into ovivory and then macropredatory niches as they evolved to hunt the abundant Dracoavian chicks and eventually adults. In this episode, we will examine 2 other clades of mammals that, thanks to ecological pressures placed upon them by surviving Dracoavians, have rebounded and diversified more successfully than their counterparts in our world, the Gondwanatheres and the Monotremes. First, we will discuss the most basal of the surviving clades of mammals, the monotremes. The last of the egg-laying mammals in our world, the monotremes are represented by the ornithorhynchids and tachyglossids, which likely split at some point between 35 million and 80 million years ago, with genetic data from Zhao et al. Suggesting a probable divergence point around 55 million years ago in the early Eocene. Earlier studies have found very different time ranges, with Meredith et al.'s molecular phylogenomic overview suggesting a range as wide as 22.4 to 103.1 million years ago, which at the upper range would give them a late Albian stage origin in the latter half of the early Cretaceous. On the other end of the dating spectrum, mitochondrial datasets from Belov and Hellman show a divergence point as recently as 21 million years ago. For this project, I will be going with the dating suggested by Zhao et al. On the divergence of ornithorhynchids and tachyglossids, and the 250 to 165 million year range suggested by Alvarez Carretero et al. For the divergence between monotremes and the ancestors of theriforms. These 2 recent studies are not necessarily the most true, as one study does not automatically supersede another by virtue of being the most recent. That's not how science works. And I encourage you to read not just the papers I have already mentioned, but my source for all of this compiled information, Flannery et al., a review of monotreme evolution, which made research for this part of the project much easier. The wide range of possible dates and the use of different genetic and molecular dating techniques are in part necessary because of the sparseness of the monotreme fossil record, which only includes the 3 extant members of the clade and 16 extinct members. This cryptic group appears to have had greater diversity up until the Cenomanian, when the more archaic Chalicodontids and Strepodontids disappear from the fossil record, leaving only the ornithorhynchoids. This should be taken with a heavy grain of salt, as while it does overlap with significant mammalian turnover during the angiosperm terrestrial revolution, we do not have evidence of these animals being replaced by different mammalian clades, better suited to the new context, as indeed the other major group of endemic Australian mammals, the Australosphenids, also appear to have vanished from the fossil record at the same time. Is it possible that these groups were displaced by other mammals migrating into the region from another part of Gondwana? Yes, but there is no fossil evidence of any members of Allotheria or Theria in Mesozoic Australia, leaving such a hypothesis to be mere speculation. What can be said, though, is that the recent discoveries from the Lightning Ridge of New South Wales show that this clade was more diverse in the Cretaceous before it, like many other mammalian clades, was devastated by the KPG impact. After being decimated by the end Cretaceous extinction, the ornithorhynchoids would persist in southern Gondwana, with most Cenozoic members of the clade being found in Australia, and the sole known South American member being the Paleocene-era Monotrematum. After that long preamble, this is where the story of the clade in the world of dragons of the Cenozoic begins in earnest, with the sole monotreme of the Sobral Formation, Eos and Agrutes antarcticensis. Known from 2 upper molars, 3 lower molars, and a fragmentary tibia, the animal is itself not particularly well documented. However, from these remains, it appears to have had a mass of around 4 kilograms, comparable to Monotrematum from our world. Indeed, there would be very little to distinguish the animal from Monotrematum were it not for an isotopic analysis of the teeth showing that, rather than eating freshwater crustaceans, mollusks, and soft-bodied fish, Eos and Agrutes was primarily eating saltwater crustaceans, mollusks, and soft-bodied fish. This small coastal monotreme represents the earliest documented movement of the clade into a marine or semi-marine niche. Whether it is a true member of Pelagorhynchidae or a stem relative remains unknown, though genetic data places the divergence of pelagorhynchids and ornithorhynchids sometime later in the Paleocene. The pressure to move beyond the rivers and lakes of the Weddellian Isthmus into coastal semi-marine niches came from 2 catalysts. The first of these factors was the migration of Eotestudoides from Australia and eastern Antarctica into the west. As these semi-aquatic thyreophorans colonized western Gondwana, Chelosomidae's presence in the isthmus did not expatriate these mammals from the rivers and lakes, as later findings in Patagonia and Australia will show that basal ornithorhynchids and chelosomids were able to live together just fine, feeding on similar prey and competing over nesting sites without driving the other to extinction. As I have said before, niche exploitation is not necessarily a zero-sum game, and there are many instances today where animals occupy similar niches yet do not drive each other to extinction. This is in part because when intraspecific competition is intense enough, it helps competitively inferior species persist against pressures put upon them by competing species. In the case of the ornithorhynchids and chelosomids, the benefits of the mammal's superior prey detection capabilities and parental care are balanced out against the hyper-competitive nature of the chelosomids caused by their R-strategy reproduction, which sees thousands of the tiny para-ankylosaurs born into the rivers and lakes at the same time. However, this competition can incentivize some members of a species to pioneer into spaces with less competition. In Australia, this will lead to the rise of ornithorhynchids which feed higher in the water column, and even manage to venture into ambush predator niches before the invasion of the continent by mecosukine crocodiles in the late Paleocene. In western Antarctica and Patagonia, this will lead to the pelagorhynchids, which will start with animals like Eos and Agrutes, moving into brackish estuaries and then coastal environments. This is where our second catalyst comes in. just as the ornithorhynchids could not have moved into macropredatorial niches were it not for the gap between the extirpation of Australia's Mesozoic crocodilians and the arrival of the Asian mecasuchines, the pelagorhynchids likely could not have made their push into the coastal marine environments had it not been for the decimation of durophagous elasmobranchs like skates and rays, which saw massive drops in species diversity in the aftermath of the KPG. These sharks, skates, and rays, which fed on bivalves and benthic invertebrates, would eventually rebound in diversity, but for much of the Paleocene, they were a shadow of their former abundance. Facing competition from chelosomids, these basal ornithorhynchoids would move into an environment where competition was not as intense and prey was abundant, becoming the first, but certainly not last, mammal lineage to conquer the sea. Next, we move on to a clade of mammals that are just as cryptic, the Gondwanatheres. This predominantly, as the name might suggest, Gondwanan clade, is known from South America, Africa, Madagascar, India, Antarctica, and potentially southern North America, though this is heavily contested. The placement of Gondwanatheria and its parent clade Allotheria is more of an actively debated topic than Monotremata, which by virtue of their survival are understood as crown mammals. Gondwanatheria has been argued to either be the last of the non-mammalian cynodonts or some form of allothere, with its potential placement in Allotheria being unclear. Some parsimony analyses place it as sister to Multituberculata. Undated Bayesian analyses appear to have the clade nested within Multituberculata, as a sister to the Taniolaboids. Tip-dated Bayesian analyses have it as sister to Euhermyida, and one constrained parsimony analysis finds the three clades and the enigmatic Cephalodon to represent a Ptolemy or simultaneous speciation event. While it would be fascinating for Gondwanatheria to represent the longest-lasting lineage of non-mammalian cynodonts, the findings of Hoffman et al. And Mao et al. Strongly support Gondwanatheria and Allotheria as a whole being crown group mammals, more closely related to therians than monotremes, so they will be treated as such for this project. That being said, King and Beck 2020 argue that tip-dated analyses can show that Allotheria is not monophyletic and that Gondwanatheria, while possibly a crown mammal, can only confidently be placed as a mammaliform. So once again, while the project won't be using the King and Beck phylogeny, I urge you to read these papers yourself. With regards to Gondwanatheria's placement within Allotheria, this project will be going off the results from the parsimony analysis, which found Gondwanatheria to be sister to Multituberculata. This is because of the placement of Magellanodon by Goyne et al. 2020, showing closer phylogenetic affinities between Ferugliotherids and Sudamericids, as has been historically supported. If the science changes and becomes more settled on a different conclusion in the future, this will obviously have to change and be subject to retcons. But for the time being, Gondwanatheria will be treated as a monophyletic infraclass containing 3 superorders, which we would consider associated with the families Ferugliotheridae, Groberidae, and Sudamericidae. But in the world of dragons of the Cenozoic are the superorders Pseudocalcamytheria, Zygonotheria, and Sudamericotheria. Of these 3 clades, basal members of Pseudocalcamytheria and Sudamericotheria are present in the Sobral. We will start with the most basal of the 2 clades present in the formation, the Ferugliotherids, or as they are known in the world of dragons of the Cenozoic, the Pseudocalcamytheres. This most basal of the Gondwanathere clades has a blade-like lower premolar that sets them apart from the 2 more derived clades and makes them appear to be more similar to the northern hemisphere multituberculates that Gondwanatheres are sister to. In addition to this, their teeth are only partially covered in enamel, unlike the Sudamericotheres. Instead, only the lip-facing band of teeth is covered in enamel, with the softer lingual-facing portion of the teeth being composed mostly of dentin. In the early days of taxonomy, this rodent-like convergence on the enamel, as well as their filling many rodent-like niches, would lead to the belief that Pseudocalcamytherians were members of a now-defunct clade known as Insectivora. Parallels would be drawn between their venomous tarsal spurs and the venomous bites of shrews, and would contribute to the erroneous belief that most, if not all, insectivorans were venomous to some degree. These tarsal spurs would be one feature that would contribute to the failure to group Pseudocalcamytherians with the other two clades of Gondwanatheres until very recently. This was because these more derived clades had already lost the venomous tarsal spur deeper into their ancestry. Similar losses of the spur independently occurred in the lineages of Multituberculata, with animals like Quetzalcoatl having the spur, but the more derived Taniolaboids lacking them. The more common of the two Pseudocalcamytherians present in the formation is the small Conophractor sobralensis, best described as a basal pseudocalcamoid, similar to late Cretaceous members of the clade like Furugliotherium in both size and dentition. These animals are mostly known from teeth and a partial lower jawbone, though there is an ulna in association with some teeth that is suspected to have belonged to the little mammal. With their small tweezer-like front teeth, they competed with the eudontic gnats like Austeropteryx to feed on the seeds of monkey puzzle trees and other Antarctic conifers. Unlike most of the Sudamericotherians that we will see, these animals did not grind up entire cones for their nutrient-rich seeds, instead carving small incisions in the tough cones and then plucking the seeds with their incisors to process them with their large blade-like premolars. Unlike the more diverse eudontic gnats, which seem to have radiated fairly quickly into specializing in specific trees and seeds similar to Darwin's finches, Conophractor was a more generalized feeder, possibly even branching into insectivory. As with all of these more basal members of the clade, it had a greater range of articulation in its spinal column than that present in the other two Gondwanathere superorders, which is another similarity it shared with the more arboreal multituberculates and euharamyidans. However, a characteristic it shared with the other Gondwanatheres was the presence of a large, almost therian-like obturator foramen, aiding in the flexibility of its pelvis, similar to that of the more derived but older Madagascan Gondwanathere Adelatherium. This, along with the fact that multituberculates exhibit placenta-like growth rates, suggests that the pseudoplacenta, which all Gondwanatheres have, may be ancestral to Allotheria. Because of the lack of a true placenta or pseudoplacenta in Metatherians and Meridiolestids, the debate over whether these are homologous structures that are ancestral to Theriformes, but were lost for whatever reason in these other two clades, or whether they are analogous structures independently evolved at least twice, remains unresolved. While the pseudoplacenta of the Gondwanatheres allows for longer gestation in the womb prior to birth than in either the Metatherians or Meridiolestids, the epipubic bone remains a limiting factor in the size and development of the young at birth, with basal members of all three superorders, like Conophractor, giving birth to very small altricial young. The other Pseudocalcamythera of the formation was the considerably larger Dendrotherium. With an estimated size of about 7 kilos, Dendrotherium is known from a single specimen, but is one of the most complete Paleocene mammals of Antarctica, with a near-complete lower jaw, humerus, radius, clavicle, and ulna being known. While its size is more similar to that of the Maastrichtian Magellanodon, its teeth are more basal, like those of Conophractor, Furugliotherium, and the enigmatic late Eocene, early Oligocene Furugliotherid from our world, LACM 149371. This larger animal did not have the claws of Conophractor, which hints that it was neither arboreal like its small relative, nor was it a digger like the Sudamericotherians it lived alongside, reinforcing that it had a pickier diet, competing more with the elasmarians like Baradromius fragilis and herbivorous theropods like Balder than the robust Sudamericotherians and Thyreophorans.
where animals like Conifractor will diversify and spread into South America and give rise to several unique arboreal and gliding clades that persist to the modern day. Animals like Dendrotherium will have no real future in South America, being largely outcompeted by notoungulates and Sudamericotherians by the end of the Paleocene, and then finally driven to extinction with the arrival of the caviomorph rodents in the Oligocene. A similar fate awaits Dendrotherium's successors on Antarctica. However, neither of these competitors will ever make it to Australia, or if they do, the fossil record will not record it. Instead, Dendrotherium's descendants will give rise to the Australocalciforms, one of the defining mammal groups of the continent alongside the marsupials, mesongalotoids, and monotremes. But that is a story for another time. Instead, we will move on to Antarctica's Danian Sudamericotherians, Musvidus, Marimbeotherium, and Sudamericotherium. All three of these animals are teeth taxa, with no postcranial material ascribed to them. However, the varying sizes of their teeth and isotopic analyses tell us a lot about what niches these animals filled. All were exclusively herbivorous, but Marimbeotherium's diet of predominantly notonuphar and Nelumbo water lilies and Azolla water ferns shows that this animal was living most of its life in the water and feeding on softer-bodied plants than you'd expect from these basal Sudamericotherians. While it will be some time before the first definitive member of Amazonatheria will emerge in the late Paleocene, it's not difficult to see a member of Marimbeotherium as a sort of tentative first step in this direction. This may have been caused by increased competition with thyreophorans like Hoplophosphorus. While Marimbeotherium avoided competition with animals like Hoplophosphorus by specializing in a new niche, competition between the mammals and Dracoavians contributed to the largest Gondwanatheria yet, assuming Patagomaya is not actually a Gondwanatheria, which is debated. At 35 kilos, Musvidus cothondonta was an eating machine, capable of grazing on early grasses, grit-covered tubers, and high silica and phytolith content ferns. This giant of the Danian was the second largest animal on the continent, and had converged considerably with the Taniolaboids of North America, though in life it would have been easy to tell apart from the multituberculate by the prominent jugal flanges that it sported, which most Sudamericotherians possess. Adults were essentially immune to predation from the carnivorous meridiolestids and theropods of the continent, but given the altricial nature of their young, they were very vulnerable to nest raiders for the first few months of life. Because they were too large to be quite as fossorial as their smaller relatives, making denning less effective, they lived in large social groups led by a dominant mated pair, typically the oldest, who would nest at the center of the herd, while lower-ranking pairs would nest in circles of seniority radiating out from the dominant pair. This offered protection in numbers from predators and also ensured the more senior members of the herd would be the least likely to have their offspring fall victim to the inevitable predation events which occurred in lapses in security. The most basal of the Antarctic Sudamericotherians was Sudamericotherium itself. Remaining small, it would not have been particularly large when compared to many of its Mesozoic relatives, smaller in fact than animals like Adelatherium or Ventana. To add to that, it lived in much the same way its pre-KPG ancestors did, grazing on early grasses and eating grit-covered roots, which it dug up thanks to its fossorial lifestyle. It was a simple lifestyle, and they still fell prey to theropods and larger mammalian predators, but they ultimately successfully lived in a niche that was not threatened by any Dracoavians, or even the notoungulates when they inevitably expanded their range out of northern South America all the way to West Antarctica. Competition with xenarthrans would of course impact them, as would the arrival of the caviomorphs. But basal animals similar to Sudamericotherium would survive all the way to the Miocene, before shifting climates would at last be the end of them. However, though they would go extinct, the superorder they ushered into the world would survive to the modern day, an ancient but ever-changing mammal lineage that evolved alongside the dragons of the Cenozoic. Next time we travel 3 million years into the future to late Danian South America, In a hothouse world that only seems to be getting hotter, the Dracoavians have expanded in size and diversity. But a different clade of archosaurs survived the apocalypse here, and has already claimed dominion over the continent. This is a world ruled in cold blood.